Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. And as some of you already know, I stumbled ass backwards into mindfulness and insight meditation 24 years ago, during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder, which had blown up into agoraphobia. I was unable to leave the house. I was unable to go to work. I was on short-term disability. And I happened to get paired up with a psychologist who was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And this is what he offered me as a way of dealing with the issues that I was confronted with. And I was not thrilled with his suggestion. My life had come to a stop. I couldn't go out. I couldn't work. I couldn't do anything. And here's this guy saying, well, let's sit and watch the breathing for a while. Okay. Thanks, I guess. So I figured, well, I'm at home panicking all day anyway, not really going anywhere. So he didn't give me anything else. I guess I'll give this a shot just long enough I can go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now? And that was 24 years ago. And I never did have that conversation with him. And here I am doing things like this and still practicing. And I'm ready to admit that there was something to it all. And this is usually the part where I jump off into whatever topic that I'm going to talk about for the day. And in this case, I'm really not veering very far, because today's topic is really about some of those early insights that came up during that time when I first started. There's this phrase that if you're going through hell, keep going. Not sure who came up with that first, but it's always resonated with me because it's got this grim, not just this grim determination to it, but also kind of this grim humor. There's a little sarcastic, wry humor in there. Like, well, yeah, if you're in the middle of hell, why would you stop there? Right? I mean, let's see about getting to the other side. And it's important to remember that there is another side. And one of the themes that will come up again and again in today's talk, and pretty much anything you read or study in the area of Theravada Buddhism, which is what I study, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. What you find again and again as an ongoing theme is that the other side of hell, getting to that other side, getting out, if you will, isn't really a matter of where we're physically situated. It's a matter of where we are situated in the mind. And that's good news, because that's the only thing that we can really, truly have some effect over. So this notion of, well, if you're going through hell, keep going. Okay. If we're going to keep going, though, the first thing we want to make sure is we're at least not getting in our own way. All right? So I mentioned Theravada Buddhism. What the hell is Theravada Buddhism? Theravada Buddhism refers to the teachings of the historical Buddha from 2,500 years ago, as best we know them, as they've been passed down over millennia and around the world. And the Buddha only taught one thing. How do we alleviate our own suffering? This is the whole point of practice. Why do we practice mindfulness? For the sake of mindfulness itself? No. We practiced it for the sake of clear seeing. Well, why the hell would we do that? Because only through clear seeing are we going to be able to see how we are getting in our own way and causing ourselves suffering. Or, suffering is sometimes a romanticized term. We tend to think of it as, Sisyphus trying to get the rock up the mountain, or we might even glamorize our suffering. Well, I suffer for my art and I suffer for this, and you're not going to take that away from me. There's an American monk whose work I read and quote a lot, Thanissaro Bhikkhu. He doesn't use the word suffering so much as stress. Nobody wants their stress. Hey, give me my stress. That's my stress. I'm going to hey. We can think of it as stress, causing ourselves stress. This is effectively what I did to myself for almost a decade, which is what led to me being housebound, effectively crippled in life. I did not get anything out of the very first sitting I ever did, which was with the psychologist that I mentioned earlier. I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to be doing. I thought that this was useless and was basically panicking throughout the whole thing. And then he said, okay, so you should try this at least once a day. Try for like 15, 20 minutes on a regular basis. I consider myself fortunate in a way that I thought that this whole mindfulness thing, of course, this was long before it became, the flavor of the month, right? I'd never heard of this. And in a way, I consider myself fortunate that I thought that it was at best a nice idea, but for people who had problems maybe not quite as bad as mine. And at worst was horseshit. Because I had absolutely no expectation for it. I didn't think it was going to do a thing. So I wasn't looking for anything. I remember my very first solo sitting, which was the next day after I had done it with him. And I did what he said. I just sat and watched. And almost immediately, I saw this incredible, I can't even say I saw it, I felt it. I felt this incredible exhaustion, which of course I'd been feeling for months anyway. But I mean, I really felt it in a new way because I was simply looking at it instead of trying to do anything with it. And I didn't just feel what it felt like. I saw the process of how it was happening. Because like anything else, exhaustion, feelings, perception, these aren't static things. They're processes. Another Buddhist teaching on karma, cause and effect. There are causes that lead to effects which become causes for more effects. So I'm seeing how this process is playing out. And how that process was playing out was this ungodly civil war that was happening inside of me. Between this part that was feeling all of this panic and this part of me that found that process of panic unacceptable and was attempting to annihilate it, defeat it, squash it. And I saw that it wasn't even so much the panic or the fear of panic that was causing the exhaustion, so much as the internal battle between these two sides. And in that moment, I actually had my very first insight ever in this practice, from which maybe every other insight I've ever had since has, you could say, come from, because I think it kind of encompasses everything. That insight very simply is if you fight yourself, you've already lost. There's no good end to that. This fighting ourselves, in my experience, almost invariably comes from a thought process of, I shouldn't be feeling this. And the interesting thing that happens from a psychological standpoint is that we end up having one thought fighting another thought. And in this case, I'm commingling thoughts and feelings to a degree, mental processes. Because really a feeling is a thought process with a felt sense, right? So we can kind of commingle thought and feeling here a bit. A thought fighting with a thought, a feeling fighting with a feeling. And what's really interesting is we don't just have the two thoughts or feelings, do we? We don't just have, in my case, the panic process, the panic thought, the panic feeling, and then the one saying, that's not okay. It's not just those two. What happens is there's now a third process that comes in and identifies with one of those two. In my case, identifies with the one that says that panic is not okay. And I think of that one as being me. The panic's not really me. The thing that says that panic's not okay, that's me. And there's another thought process forming an identification, because something has to be forming an identification with one thought over the other, right? So there's now three thought processes going. Identifying with our thoughts or feelings in the first place as being who I am, as being us, that's me. That's an example of unclear seeing. A line of logic that doesn't hold up. But when we cling to it, when we fall for that illusion, causes us all kinds of stress and suffering. Because if that thought is who I am, then who am I when I'm thinking something else? And even stranger is this phenomenon I mentioned a moment ago where we start identifying with some thoughts and not others. Oh no, that thought is me. That's the real me. That one's not. Huh? How's that a thing? How are we ascertaining that? Well, with just more thinking. It's so circular, right? How can I be that thought and not that thought? Or for that matter, how can I be that thought and that thought? And by the way, who's the one listening to all of these thoughts? Right? Where does this end? Where does this end? Does this sound like a line of reasoning, of perception that's going to lead to less suffering or more suffering? I mean, I can tell you what I found. If this whole happy horseshit thing worked, we wouldn't be here, right? I wouldn't be talking about this. If there was a happy ending to that kind of scenario, I'd have found it. Someone here would have found it. So, the fact is, we don't get to choose what thoughts come up. Right? We don't make a choice that, I mean, sometimes we'll decide to think about a certain thing, but things come up to the mind, unbidden, right? All the time. So why do we decide of these things that come up unbidden? Because Lord knows I wasn't asking for panic, right? Of these things that come up unbidden to the mind, how and why do we decide that, oh, that's the right one, and that's the one that's really running the show, and that's who I am, and that not so much? And what I found in my experience is that my biggest problems are not my thoughts and my feelings. My biggest problems end up being my thoughts and my feelings about my thoughts and my feelings. The Buddha talks a lot about the sources of suffering being greed, hatred, and delusion. Greed, give me that. I want more of that. That's mine. I need that. That clinging. Hatred's just the flip side. Get rid of that. I don't want that. Get that the hell out of here. And delusion is the mother of all of them. That's where the greed and the hatred really come from. And we can see that in play here. This delusion that in my case, I was running into saying, okay, that thought is me and that thought's not me, and this thought has to kill that thought. And That's a whole lot of delusion right there. That's a whole lot of identification. That's a whole lot of deciding that I'm a static, unchanging being that is somehow synonymous with these thoughts and feelings that come and go in an instant. Man, that doesn't end well. And that kind of delusion, that unclear seeing, results in that greed. Give me that. I want that feeling. I want that hatred. Get that thought out. I need to kill that. That's where it happens. So these were some of my early insights into power versus force. Force always meets counterforce. I'm sure I don't have to mention what's been going on in the world in the last few days about how force meets counterforce. But this also happens within us. Because ultimately that's what we're acting out in an outward way, is the conflict we're feeling inside, isn't it? Force repels. Power attracts. I like to say that force drains and power sustains. Lord knows, I probably didn't come up with that. I probably heard that somewhere and co-opted it. So if you see somebody else said that like 20 years ago, I believe it. The force is trying to control our feelings. Really just using one thought and feeling to try to control another one. Power is making space for those thoughts and feelings to process. Because they're not going to go away till they do anyway. I won't tell the whole story, but some of you have heard what I call my Newton Center story, which is one of my very early insights into this, a very profound one for me, where when I started learning how to get out of the house again, I did it very slowly because of the panic. It was freaking me out. So I had I was walking around a block, and then I was walking around 2 blocks, and eventually started to drive very short distances again because I needed to, not get too far from the safety zone of my apartment, right? And then one particular day, I went a little further than usual and was about 15 minutes from home, which for me at the time was horrifying. And was in a little gift shop and suddenly realized, if I lose it here, if panic takes me over right here, right now, I can't get home fast enough. I'm screwed. And of course, that exact line of thinking did what? Started the cycle of panic. And at that moment, part of me realized that this was true. Yeah, I was basically fucked. If anything took me over. But there was also another part of me that had just a little bit of anger, frustration, just enough to say, you know what? Yeah, you're right. You're right. I can't do anything about this. If this happens here, this happens here. And I got a little attitude about it. I said, all right, fine. Do it then. I can't do anything about it anyway. Go ahead. Let it rip. And all of a sudden, it was like 30 pounds had fallen from me onto the floor. And everything just settled. And I'm like, what the hell? That civil war that was happening inside of me that I'd been talking about at the beginning. Well, I ended up finding out that it took 2 of us to fight. When the me that I was identifying with said, all right, I'm done fighting. that other side that I was thinking, that's not me. There was no fight anymore. And it was like the weapons on that side dropped too. I was mentioning how that if you're going through hell, keep going. It has this grim humor to it. One of my favorite quotes, and again, I don't know who said this either. One of my favorite quotes is, the quickest way to end a war is to lose it. And I'm not going to get into whether that's a good thing or not, but in this case, that's kind of what I did. There was this inner surrender. And that came from a place of power. I stopped the force of trying to kill off a part of myself and opened to the process that I'd been trying to kill. And found that when it had a chance to simply process, so the problem wasn't really the feeling. The problem all this time has been what I've been doing with it. And that's what the Buddha was getting at. That's the suffering. That's the stress. We hear so often in spiritual and meditation practices that what we're doing is noting what's here now, what's here now, what's here now. And yep, that's a huge part of it. But that's not the whole story. What's here now, but what am I doing with it? There may be pain here. Pain's going to happen. We don't have a choice about that. The suffering, the stress, that comes from what we're doing with it. Imagine if I had allowed the feelings of panic that eventually brought me down, or I should say what I was doing with them eventually brought me down. It took me 8 years to get to that point. Imagine if I had just opened to them and allowed them to process after 8 days or 8 weeks or 8 minutes instead of 8 years. A very different scenario, right? So that early experience that I had, where I said, okay, show me what you got, and finally actually saw what it had and was like, oh, holy shit, okay, that's different. Didn't see that coming. That led me to a couple of other really, for me, profound insights. First off, when we feel vulnerable, we harden around that. This natural attempt to protect, which in the physical world may make sense sometimes. In the mental and emotional world, not so much. Not in my experience. We put up these walls to try to keep things out. And what I find again and again and again, what the walls end up doing is keeping things in. It's one of the hardest things to do, which is why it takes so much practice, but learning how to soften around feelings of vulnerability. It does let things in, and it also lets things out. This is where the power of curiosity comes in. Meeting vulnerability with curiosity, which is what I did. If you think about it, in that story that I told, I developed a little attitude about it, you know. I'm not saying it was this soft, lilting spiritual thing like, oh, come in, let me give you tea, and I'm going to listen to... Yeah, sometimes it's like that, but that's not what I'm advocating here. In that case, it was all right, fuck you, dude, I'm not fighting anymore. Look, bam, what do you got? So, I mean, I was being bitchy about it, right? There's a little bitchiness happening there. But still, I was making genuine space for it. And there was curiosity there. Okay, I'm here in the middle of this gift shop. We might put on a show for these people, all right? I don't know what's going to happen next. But I'm tired of fighting it off. to the point where I've finally seen it's going to be less painful. And absolutely there's going to be less suffering in just seeing what the hell it is that I'm trying to stop. And the other thing that this really pointed out to me was how suffering, stress, requires thinking. It's thinking. I have a session on karma where the first thing I do is read the first few lines of the Dhammapada, which is a collection of teachings from the Buddha. And the very first one, the very first line, he says, mind precedes all phenomena. It all begins with mind. Stress and suffering require a thought process, these storylines, these identifications with these thoughts and these feelings. It's like those horror movies where the call is coming from inside the house. Again, not just what's here. What am I doing with what's here? So I mentioned how I was not thrilled with the psychologist's initial offering of, hey, let's watch the breathing. And this is one of the reasons why watching the breathing in meditation, and it doesn't have to be the breathing. We want to develop our powers of concentration to a degree, and we need something to focus on. And the breathing it's always here. It's always changing. So it's handy. But one of the reasons it's handy, especially in the initial stages, is because another one of these insights that I had early on was what I call the direction of grip, where we feel like thoughts, like for me, panic. Thoughts have a grip on us. We can't get away from them. But I realized, no, suffering and stress come from thinking, and these thoughts don't have volition. I do. So if there's a direction of gripping happening here, it's not the thoughts gripping me, it's me gripping the thoughts. And by focusing our attention on the breathing, by shifting our attention to the breathing, that, in addition to a bunch of other benefits that we can't get into today, just in the initial stages is effective because we are shifting our attention away from the thoughts and feelings that we are gripping. It's the pink elephant effect. If I tell you don't think of a pink elephant, all you're going to picture is a pink elephant. If I tell myself don't think about panic, all I'm going to think about is panic. But if we stop telling ourselves what not to focus on and instead simply focus on something else. And yeah, that other thing will come up and come up and come up and come up because we've habituated that. And that's why so much of this practice is coming back to our object of concentration, because we're building a skill here, like learning a musical instrument or anything else. Many of the Buddha's analogies, he talked about skill building and playing music and learning how to do something better and better and stepping back, evaluating our progress and how we're doing. And speaking of progress, and I'm talking a little bit longer than I usually do, so I'll wrap this up in a moment. We'll get to some sitting, okay? But speaking of progress, because this is an important one, and this really helped me in the early days when everything felt just goddamn hopeless, okay? One of the things that the Buddha talks about is impermanence. And I don't have time to get into it today, but the idea being it's bad enough that we cling and grasp to things. It's even worse when those things are impermanent, which anything that's based in cause and effect is. Anything that comes up based on causes and conditions will cease to exist at some point because causes and conditions change. Again, that monk I mentioned earlier, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, he doesn't use the word suffering, he uses the word stress. He also doesn't really use the word impermanence. Because any of us can think, oh yeah, of course things are impermanent. I'm going to die someday and this will never be. He uses the word inconstancy. Because this drives home how things are really changing right now, all the time. And that includes this practice. It was very critical for me in the early days and today. This hasn't changed. And this is why I wanted to make sure to mention this. It's important. Our practice is going to be inconstant. Okay? These thoughts and feelings I've been talking about, we're going to have thoughts and feelings about our practice and how we're doing. And they're going to be inconstant. I often say this is a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back affair. There are going to be times when we feel like we don't know what the hell we're doing, or it's pointless, or whatever. We need to allow space for that inconstancy in our practice. Sometimes we're going to have a very relaxing sitting, and we're going to think, oh, that's where I'm at now. That's me, that identification again. That's what I've earned. That's what I've got. And then the next time, well, we've had that expectation and now we don't meet at that time. It's not so good. Well, shit, what the hell happened? That's this expectation. Now we have to meet it. And suddenly we're putting requirements on our practice and judging our practice based on our requirements. And it never worked for me. Allow the practice to unfold in its own time. Worry less about what the effects are because you can't really control those. Worry more about the causes and conditions that you're setting. It's like I said at the beginning. If you're going through hell, keep going. And hell is really more a state of mind rather than a state of where we're physically situated. And that's a good thing because that's the only thing we can really do something about. Same thing. We can't ever completely control, or even sometimes at all control, the effects, including what we are feeling at any given time. But we can control what we are doing, the causes and conditions that we are setting. And as long as we continue to work on those, I have found that the rest of it will take care of itself in time. And that's what's gotten me to the point I'm at here today compared to where I started. And they are two very, very different places. I've definitely gone way over in the talking now. I had a few more points, but maybe we'll do another one of these another time and I'll get to some of the other ones because there's a lot. Why don't we sit for a bit? I want to make sure we have time for a sitting and then we'll get to some Q&A and so forth, okay? The one cue that I like to give before we sit is that if you are seated, to have your hips elevated higher than your knees if possible, which is good for your posture as well as your breathing. If that's not possible right now, not a problem. Something to keep in mind, perhaps for next time. And I'd like you to imagine that you are suspended from the ceiling by a string attached to the top of your head. As a cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If you're feeling some tension right now, that's completely fine. If you remember that distinction between power versus force. Sometimes we're feeling tension and we try to force it away. And what are we using to force it away? Well, more tension, right? Doesn't make sense. How are we going to get rid of tension with tension? So we can simply make space for the tension that is there. It's allowed to be here. And if there's no tension, that's fine too. You can also notice what is in contact with the chair, the floor. So we have a sense of grounding. Something is supporting us. Even if we don't feel particularly supported right now, something is supporting us. And we can let it take care of that. Let's take a moment to notice the support underneath us, and the gentle lift from the ceiling, and anything else that happens to be in between at the moment. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And very often when we bring our attention to our breathing, it changes, simply by bringing attention to it. It may also change because we think it needs to be a certain way for our meditation. In some styles of meditation, that might be true. That is not true here. No particular style of breathing, no particular length of breathing, no particular depth of breathing, no particular feeling of breathing is required. Our meditative breath here is simply the breath that is happening as we sit here meditating, watching, observing, feeling. Exactly as it is. We need not exert force over the breathing. We have the option of using our power to simply make space for it as it is. And to make space for any feelings about it that arise as we watch it as it is. Like, this should be deeper. This should be slower. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel comfortable. Anything. The same way we want to move through hell, well, these things want to move too. Again, they're processes. Let them process. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to let them run completely amok. If we have trauma in our background, as I do, maybe we do this in pieces. Manageable chunks. You touch it a little bit, move it away. This is part of building that skill. Learning what's an appropriate, manageable amount of working with what pain might be here. And exercising compassion for it as well as ourselves. Because, well, all of it is ourselves, isn't it? Let's take a couple of minutes with the breathing and simply making space for it as it is. if you're finding it challenging to stay with the breathing because things are coming up, that's completely normal. That's one of the effects of using our power, funnily enough. We're making space for things to process, and, well, if you're like me and use force all the time and try to squelch these things down, and then all of a sudden you say, okay, now you can come out. Well, oh, they're going to come. So even though it's not exactly the point, because we do want to maintain our focus on the breathing, that is our intention. If a lot of things are coming up, ironically, that can be a sign that, well, you're on the right track because you're making the space. So that'll happen. And that will become more manageable, but doesn't necessarily ever stop. Certainly hasn't stopped for me, almost a quarter century into this. But that's okay. It's not a requirement that it does. Again, it's not just what's here. It's what are we doing with it? Like, oh, okay, there was thinking again. Or there was a distraction from a bodily sensation again. Okay, notice it and we come back. And over time, we catch these things a little sooner and a little sooner. And again, building a skill. And again, if we find ourselves thinking we're doing it wrong, we don't know what the hell we're doing. Well, once we catch ourselves thinking that and seeing that thought process, you're doing it right. Okay? Because you're seeing what's happening. And you can take a moment and see, okay, what am I doing with that? What am I doing with that? That's building the skill. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to work with managing all of the thinking that comes up, and I'd like to offer a couple of strategies for that. Because again, if we're going to be building skills, we need some tools. You might try simply observing the sensations, the energy in the body around the breathing. You may focus on one very small area where you feel it. You may spread out to the entire body. You may go back and forth. You might start at one part of the body and move to another. Again, the pink elephant effect. Not saying stop thinking, because good luck with that. I mean, stop thinking is a thought. Too late. Saying, no. Change the focus. Change the direction of attention. Can you feel the energy and sensation in the body around the breathing? How it moves, changes, shifts. Is it pleasant, unpleasant? Can we make space for that? if there are some areas in the body where we might be feeling some resistance. Resistance, like all the other things I've talked about, is not a static, solid thing. It's a process. It's something that is happening. It might even be something that we are doing. And you know what else is a process? The breathing. The breathing is a process. And again, what we're doing here is setting different causes and conditions and seeing what the effects are, like a scientist. So what happens? What happens if we allow the breath process to meet the resistance process? To touch it, to surround it. Maybe permeate it, go through it. What happens? You may also try that same technique with whatever pockets of resistance you might be finding in the mind. The Buddha taught that we have 6 senses. The 5 that we all know and love. But the mind was also a sense. So we can breathe while focusing on something visual. We can breathe while focusing on a sound. We can breathe into a process of resistance that we are perceiving in thinking. Not by thinking about the thinking, because we've already talked about where that goes. Using our power to make space. For the process to unfold. While we watch with the clear seeing that I talked about at the beginning, the clear seeing that we are developing. Using these tools to develop the skills of clear seeing so we can truly, at a felt level, understand where we're getting in our way by seeing not just what's coming up, but what we're doing with it. And this is how we change where we are in our mind. And that's how we get to the other side. Okay, I'm going to put a few links in the chat before we get to some Q&A. These free sessions are supported by one-on-ones that I do with folks. I have a limited number of spots for people who would like to delve a little bit deeper into some of these things, and perhaps we can work through things the same way that others have helped me and so many others work through things over countless years. And so if you are interested in something like that, the first link is to my website, mindfulness-and-bluejeans.com. You're welcome to reach out through there or set something up if you like. The second link is my YouTube channel. I post some of these sessions and some of the other sessions I have out on Insight Timer and Simple Habit and some of those places out on YouTube once every couple of weeks or so. So if you subscribe on there, you'll get a little notice that I've put up another session. There's a link there for Patreon as well. Some people have asked about helping to contribute or donate to some of these. Patreon's a great way to do that on a one-time or recurring basis. All of the sessions are up there as well. And I've also added my Venmo for those who are interested in providing some dana or donation that way. So with that, we can open it up for some Q&A, discussion, anything you might have observed during today. I see Joni. Hi, Joni.
Hi, this is the first time I've taken one of your sessions.
Welcome.
Thank you. I have a question about when we were focusing on the breathing. So when the thoughts come in, am I supposed to refocus on my breathing and let the thought go? Or am I supposed to feel the thought? I was a little confused on that.
That's a fantastic question. It's sort of both. So one of the challenges in a practice like this is we're trying to communicate about experiences, felt experiences, which don't neatly translate into words. They don't always follow the rules of logic, if you will. And I am answering your question. I'm doing it in sort of a circular. I will answer it specifically. One of the things that I say sometimes is, by way of example, is I'm very left-brained, very logical. And it always amazes me how there are those times when I am able to simultaneously accept where I am in my practice and also accept that there's more to be done. Because in some ways, those are sort of mutually exclusive. How can I be okay with this, but also be okay with that? It doesn't logically quite align, but it's a thing. And that's not something that can really translate into words or logic. And your question, which is a classic one and a fantastic one, kind of falls into that same category where there is the noticing of the thought. But then you said, am I supposed to feel it? Well, that is also something that you notice. That even though one's a thought and one's a feeling, they're still just processes. And that's what we're noticing are processes. So if there's a thought process, oh, there's a thought process. And okay, we come back to the breathing. And pretty quick, another process is going to announce itself. And it may even come on the heels of the first one in your case. Oh, well, there's a feeling here too. Oh, okay, there's a feeling. And we come back to the breathing. Now, with that said, there may be times where we want to follow that thought process, that feeling somewhere. And there may be times when that is a skillful thing or not a skillful thing. And what I mean by that is, if it's just going to take us off into some daydream that we want to revel in for a while, probably not all that skillful and productive. Mm-hmm. But there may be times that we do want to actually explore it a little bit. My daily sitting I do early in the morning. And one of my challenges with that has always been, because it's so soon after I was sleeping, all of my dreams from the night before start to come up. And I've always been like really fascinated by dreams. Mm. So there are times when a dream will come up, and, you know, in my sitting, and I'm like, oh, geez, I had that dream. And I will actually make the conscious decision. You know what? I'm going to stop because what I teach is Vipassana, insight meditation. I'm going to stop my Vipassana for a couple of minutes because I feel like there's, something came up in my subconscious last night that I'm remembering clearly, and there may be value here. So in those times, yeah, I'll say, okay, I'm going to follow that. Understanding that this is not my meditation practice anymore. And then I will come back when I feel like, okay, I chased down that rabbit hole far enough to see what I feel like was worth seeing, and let's come back now.
Okay.
Experiment. It's very much a feeling out process, and one practice is never necessarily like another. In general, lean to the side of coming back to the breathing as much as possible.
Okay.
Because in the process of doing that, that is when things that need to arise will. Partially because we're making space for it, and also partially because the mind doesn't really like that. The part of the mind that's trying to protect us, which of course, like in the beginning of my talk, was the side that was saying I need to kill the panic part of the mind. It was just trying to protect. Yeah, it was well intentioned. It just wasn't skillful. When we stop following the bidding of the part of the mind that is trying to be so overprotective, it's gonna yell and scream. And that's precisely the yelling and screaming that we need to hear, so that we understand where that bidding is coming from that we keep blindly following. That's that clear seeing. This is how the concentration on the breathing actually leads us to clear seeing. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps a little bit. I'm more like I guess I would say I have like impulses to do, like my husband left me, so I have these impulses to reach out. And when they enter my head while I'm doing this deep breathing, do I acknowledge them and feel them, or I just go, nope, focus back on your breathing. Don't think about the impulses to call him. Focus on your breathing.
What happens with practice is we become able to hold the breathing and the feeling.
Okay.
Initially, it's challenging. It's always kind of challenging. Not always, but very often challenging just to hold on to the breathing, to stay with the breathing. So at first, we really focus very exclusively on that so that we can build that part of the skill. At the beginning, that's all we can really handle. We need to focus on just that one piece. As that piece gets built and solidified, that really ends up becoming more of a foundation upon which other things can now be supported. Such that, again, it doesn't quite fit into logic because we can't really think we can wholly focus on breathing and also focus on something else, but somehow it works.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that the Buddha talks about is taking refuge and taking refuge in the practice. And sometimes people get confused by that because like, well, taking refuge, that sounds like you're kind of hiding from something. It's like, no. Taking refuge isn't hiding from. Taking refuge is building a solid foundation so that you can withstand whatever is getting thrown at you without getting completely thrown off. Mm-hmm. So we are building this foundation with the breathing, building our skill at concentration and focus such that when these other powerful things come up, we can make space for them while still experiencing the breathing with them. And in fact, kind of like I was saying in the sitting, what happens if our breathing process meets our resistance process? It's that.
Okay.
If you're new to practice, some of this might sound a little weird. And again, that's going to really owe to one of two things, or maybe both. I'm either not explaining it well, which is always possible, or it's simply one of those instances where we're trying to distill a felt practice and an experiential awareness. We're trying to distill those into words, and it eventually fails. It stumbles, which is one of the challenges of this, which is why the Buddha himself said, look, don't take my word for anything I say. If you buy into everything that I say and believe it because I said it, you failed. You have to do this for yourself. This is what I found. This is what I did. You have to try it and you have to have your experience with it. And that's it. So if you're new to this, play with it, experiment with it, try things out, work with it, mold it. It's a piece of clay. See what works, see what doesn't work, set causes and conditions, see what the effects are. Geez, I think this thing's bullshit. Okay, what if I sit with that thought for a while? What happens then? Nothing's not observable. So anything counts. And we can talk about this more offline if you like. You can always drop me a line and give it some space, give it some time, and experiment and see what you find.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Yeah. No, it did. It did. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Cheers. Thank you for that.
Do you do these sessions like every Saturday?
Every other Saturday. It's usually every other week. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Cheers.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Cheers. Welcome to the group.
Thanks.
We have a hand from Patricia.
Hi.
Hi, Patricia.
Thank you so much. This is very rich, and especially the way you explained it, and the way you specifically the way you explained it, specifically your torment in your story line with running away from the panic attack, being too far from home, and just letting it and just surrendering to it. That profoundly explains the experience I've been having recently, where I have just been completely surrendering to it, to whatever it is, and that whatever it is. And I've read, through Pema Chodron, I've read a lot about that. That whatever it is might even be death. It feels so frightening, so absolutely frightening, and so profound that when you finally do surrender, it's like I'm not afraid anymore. Take it over. If you want it that bad, take it over. And that was exactly what I heard in your experience, that you had just been running so long and so exhausting, so it owns you. But it seems to be, and is this your take, that it is almost always a life or death feeling?
Yes, astute observation.
Yeah.
There's a workshop I give every so often called Mindfulness for the Professionally Anxious. And in that, I get a lot into the evolutionary aspects of why we are the way we are. Because there's a lot of weird quirks of the human condition that don't seem to make any sense until we put them against an evolutionary backdrop. And then all of a sudden, everything kind of clicks into place. And one of those things is when we were out on the African savannah tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors, pretty much any threat was a life or death threat. It was a proverbial saber-toothed tiger. It was a weather pattern. It was a lack of food. If there was a threat, it was pretty much a death threat. And most of us do not live in that kind of environment today, largely because of this world that we have built up around us. But our subconscious minds and bodies have not caught up to the world that we have built around us. So when we experience threats today, they're usually a threat of like, well, I might lose my job, or this person might leave, or that situation is not going to play out the way or this thing is, perhaps going to cause some physical pain. But subconsciously, our nervous system, they don't have those levels of nuance yet to understand, oh, there's a threat here that isn't mortal. It's, oh, there's a threat. Death is imminent. That's why we go into fight or flight over things that aren't, well, if you will, aren't worth it, which is effectively what I was doing for years with panic. Because what's panic but a fight or flight reaction gone haywire? And what was causing my panic? Well, in my case, my panic attacks were not random. My panic attacks were caused by my fear of the feeling of panic attacks. It was grotesquely circular. So if I wasn't thinking about panic, I didn't have a problem. The reason I ultimately collapsed was because after 8 years, I couldn't stop thinking about panic. So I was generating an emergency in my mind that in no way existed at all. At all. There was no threat except the one I was creating with my imagination. And my body, for years, was believing I was mortally threatened on a regular basis. So yes, that is one of these issues of the human condition that it's not our fault, but it's another one of those situations of it is here, and what are we going to do with it? It's not our fault, but we do have to manage it somehow. And I've found this practice to be a pretty powerful way to do that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Cheers. I had see a couple of things in the chat. The question is about dealing with scattered thoughts, a distraction like a plane overhead or some noise comes up and taking us away from the breathing. Great question. This again comes back to not just what's here, but how we're working with what's here. It's amazing the differences between all of us and how we manage and handle different things, which is how we know that it is possible to change how we manage and handle different things, because we all do it so differently. When I get a question like this, I'm always reminded of a session that I held back in the days when we were doing this in person, which hopefully in the near future we could start doing again. We'll still do some online too, but would like to do some in person again. But a few years ago, there was a session that I did at the Watertown Library. The Watertown Library, some of you might not even be in Massachusetts, or I know some of you here aren't even in the country. So in the Boston area here, the Watertown Library is right on Main Street, right by a very major intersection. And there was a day a few years ago that during a sitting, a car was stopped at a red light outside of the room that we were meditating in, blasting gangster rap. And there was a time in my practice where I would have been very upset by that. At this point, I'd been practicing for enough years that inwardly, I just found it kind of hilarious. And my biggest concern at that point was don't bust out laughing in this room full of people I'm trying to guide through a sitting. But what was really fascinating was afterwards. Because one of the things I said was, when we practice, and this really gets straight to the answer to your question, Sarah. When we practice, we are practicing with life as it is. And life is noisy sometimes. And that is one of the points that I got across. I used that instance of the loud music when we finished the sitting. And I said to the folks in the room, I said, was anybody disturbed by the noise? Because that's something to look at. If we're going to be disturbed by noise, yeah, we're going to have a lot of problems with our practice, aren't we? But the most fascinating thing that came up was when I said that, and a few people said, well, I found it annoying, or I noticed it and just tried to let it go, or I heard it and this, that, and the other thing. The most fascinating thing was the last person who responded, and she raised her hand, and she said the last thing I expected. She said, what gangster rap? She hadn't heard a thing. And I was like, wow, interesting. Interesting. And I'm not saying that her experience was any better than anybody else's. That's not the point. The point is, wow, how differently we can manage our experience. It really goes to show the extent to which we can work with, again, not just what's coming up, but how we're dealing with it. So, yeah, when noises come up, you notice the noise. Oh, I heard a noise. Oh, look, I got annoyed by the noise because it took me away from the breathing. Oh, you noticed that too. That's all part of the process too. If you have a requirement that you never get pulled away from the breathing, you never forget the breathing, see how that works out for you. Is that alleviating suffering, or is that causing suffering? I have a pretty good idea which way that's going to go. We have the intention. We set the causes. We set the conditions for staying with the breathing. The effect? Over time, the effect will probably become we get better at it. Do we have any say over what that effect ultimately is at any given time? No, we don't. No, we don't. And sometimes a large part of the practice is just coming to grips with that. Let it be part of the practice. Okay? I see one hand. We're just a little bit over, so I'll take this last one, and then I will need to wrap up. Yes, Lynn, please.
Thank you very much. This is the first time I've attended this.
Welcome.
And thank you. I really appreciate your thoughts. I do other meditation practices and sanghas, but this is, you have a differently grounded approach, and I appreciate it. I just wrote down what you said. We practice with life as it is, and sometimes it's noisy. And I think that's a wonderful thing to keep in mind. I was a little nervous about whether I should speak up because this is very personal, but I had an experience many years ago, probably 20, 25 years ago, when I was in my 40s or whatever. And I would go home to my family who I adored and loved, and they loved me. But there were dysfunctional issues about how we interacted. And, some of it was not being not being heard in terms of feelings and what was going on for me and pain and conflict. And I would go home full of hope that this time it would be different. I would be different. It would be positive, etc. And then I would drive home 3 hours in tears thinking, this is so miserable. It is so awful. It's not worth being alive. I wish I were dead. This is just terrible. And I would repeat this pattern over and over. And I remember once pulling over to the Framingham rest stop right before I got to Boston. And I sat there feeling these feelings. And I was like you, I got mad. I'm like, I can't take this anymore. I can't do this anymore. And I said, whatever it is, if I go commit suicide, that's what I do. It's like, I'm going forward. I'm not fighting it anymore. I just can't take this anymore. And something broke. It's like some grip over me broke. And I never felt quite, it wasn't perfect. There were still issues, but that horrible, being caught in that horrible cycle, it was just so painful. It broke, and I was able to work through things a lot more. And this is the first place I've shared it with people, particularly friends who have depression, trying to help them get to that point themselves. But I can't really convey what happened to me for them. And you're the first person that's articulated it. And I really thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've had that kind of experience. I want to say, when I say I've had that kind of experience, I don't mean your experience. I mean the one I described. I believe we are in the same ballpark too, but I don't want to make I understand your experience.
That's why I could speak.
Yeah. That kind of experience that I described for myself is one I've had a handful of times over the years in response, of course, to different things. And one of those times was about a close family relationship that was not working out as I might have liked. In fact, I think that was the most recent one. It was about 3 years ago. And in each of those instances, what I came to see, I was talking before about delusion and so forth, like the Buddha talked about, particularly with the last one a few years ago, having been through that process a few times and having been practicing so much longer, I could see the process itself, that breaking apart process itself more clearly. And the way I've started to think of it, the way I experienced it, was as a disillusionment. And I always make the joke when I say that, because I'm a Gen Xer. Like, I'm not talking about the Gen X disillusionment where we're disenfranchised and listening to Nirvana and shit. A literal disillusionment where we finally see what we're doing, how we're causing our suffering, because no one else can cause our suffering. Pain, sure. People can do things that will cause us pain. Suffering is on us. Suffering is what we do with the pain if we do not handle it skillfully, which is what we're doing in this practice, is learning how to handle it skillfully instead of doing all of the other coping mechanisms we've devised over the years that haven't worked out so well. And what I have found is, in that process of disillusionment, there is a tremendous weight lifted, not because there's no more pain. If anything, I feel the pain much more clearly because I have stopped adding the suffering on top of it. Sometimes it's a liberating feeling. Sometimes it's a really ungrounded feeling, simply because we're just so accustomed to engaging in these patterns that cause our suffering that all of a sudden, when the suffering is removed, it's a little weird. It's like, well, what the hell? So I share that not as any kind of necessarily you shared an experience and not so much a question. And what I'm sharing is not an answer, but so much a little bit more about my experience in case it perhaps either resonates with yours or perhaps clarifies something for you or perhaps gives you something to think about going forward. Or you may find that this is where our commonalities diverge, and what I just said doesn't resonate at all, which is perfectly fine as well. I simply offer it out there as it is for you to take as you will.
You know, it was very, very well connected. And I thank you for another thought you just offered, which is to separate the pain from the suffering.
Oh, yeah.
You know, people get reimbursed for their pain and their suffering, but I've never really thought about the distinction between the two.
Extremely different things. When we're talking about pain and suffering in this area, the dividing line is choice. If we're not choosing some form of discomfort, that's pain. Somebody punches me in the face, breaks my nose, that's going to hurt. Don't have a choice. What I do with that, how I handle that, whether it's anything from sending compassion to that person and going about my business and getting my nose tended to, or harboring a grudge for the next 20 years, or anything in between, that's going to determine what level of suffering I experience. That's karma. That's where karma comes in. That's on me. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have to let it go there. Thank you for being with me today. As you can tell, this is heartfelt stuff for me, and I can tell for many of you as well. So I hope that what I have gained from my experience can help everyone here in some way as you go about and develop yours. And as always, if you'd like to reach out, please feel free. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.